So a very warm welcome to all of you for joining this program today. My name is Brian. I'm the host of this webinar series. So this webinar today is part of a series, an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek Programme, hosted by the Research Institute Stickert at the London School of Economics. The aim of this webinar series is to explore a range of interdisciplinary topics that are related in some way to the intellectual contributions of economist and philosopher F.A. Hayek. These include individualism and economic freedom, the nature and future of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision-making under uncertainty, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and justice, and many others. We're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Nils Karlson. Nils is an economist and a political scientist. He is the founder of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm and has been a visiting fellow at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution. His research is focused on institutional change and the interaction between politics, markets, and civil society. He has published over 30 books and numerous academic papers. His latest book is titled Reviving Classical Liberalism Against Populism, published by Palgrave Macmillan earlier this year, which is actually the focus of today's webinar. The book is open access, and we will share it with all of you in the chats later, and as well as in the YouTube description when the video is uploaded. So please be aware that this webinar session is recorded and will be uploaded in 1 week's time. So Niels will be speaking for approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session lasting approximately 30 minutes, depending on the questions that we receive. You may drop your questions over the course of the presentation in the Q&A function below. I will be holding on to these questions and will begin posing them to our speaker at the end. So without further ado, let me hand the time over to Dr. Nils Karlson. Nils, the time is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and listening to this. It's a great honor for me. Many years ago, I did my doctoral thesis with a very Hayekian perspective. It was a book called The State of State, the role of invisible hand in politics and civil society, trying to explain how spontaneous orders works not only in markets and in civil society, but also within politics. So I'm a scholar of Hayek, but I also study many different things. And, back at the time with Hayek and Mises and Popper and all those people, well, the big threats were fascism and socialism and communism. But today, a big threat to democracy, the open society, is, I will argue, populism. So what I will try to do in this lecture is to explain what populism really is, how we can understand it, why it's a threat to liberal democracy and the open society, and perhaps how we can fight back against this threat to the free society. So I will start by let's see how this works then. There we go. For a long time, basically before the fall of the Berlin Wall, things were developing in a very good way. The democracies around the world were increasing, markets were deregulated, freedom was expanding, and Hayek got the Nobel Prize in 1974, Buchanan got it in 1986, Elinor Ostrom got it, I don't remember, that was in the 90s sometime, I think. And many people promoted, liberty, democracy, the open society. I actually myself published a book in 2017 describing how Australia and Sweden had done in order to liberalize their society, actually changing their social models from a very regulated, highly taxed type of society into a more liberal, open, market-oriented society. And as you know, I have this quote here from the paper of Francis Fukuyama in 1989. The book came a couple of years later, as you see, but he argued that, this would be the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the generalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. And this process, continued to a large extent up until 2010. But since then, things have developed in a slightly different direction. So we've seen, these populist movements from the left and from the right rising around the world. And I think you recognize most of those people here on this slide. Perhaps not the guy on the top. This is the party leader of the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, Åkesson, which for a time was the second largest party in Sweden. Now that the third, they've fallen back a little bit. But they're a right-wing populist party. But you have Maduro, you have Erdogan, you have Orban, you have Modi in India here on this slide. So how did this happen? How should we understand it? This is my question. This is something, by the way, that, well, many classical liberals, many liberals like Hayek and onwards, they didn't see this, This is a different kind of power strategy that these people are using compared to, well, what we saw in previous eras. And it is a real threat, recent development here, the results in the European election. This is the results here in the local state elections in Thüringen, they say in Germany, Thuringia, apparently in English, where this, openly Nazist, right-wing populist, authoritarian party, AfD, became the largest party, larger than the major traditional party, CDU, but also very interesting, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, the lady here down to the right, they became a party that was started in January this year, a left-wing populist party. It became the second largest party. And you have similar results in Sachsen, a neighboring state within the German Republic. And if you look at the world here, there's been a process going on here, not only caused by populism, of course, but I think populism is one of the major causes here, at least within the Western world and in developed countries, but also, of course, in developing countries. So there are less countries democratizing. The share of the world population living in autocracies have increased quite dramatically. So more than 2/3 of the world is now living in autocracies, and they are increasing. In fact, I think only 13% of the world population today lives in full democracy, liberal democracies. It's really, really problematic, and the peak of democracy was around 2010 to 2012, the number of democracies in the world. Now it's fallen back to the level of 1986, even prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall. A more recent, this previous figures come from the Vidam Institute in Gothenburg in Sweden. They have excellent statistics on this kind of stuff. This is from The Economist, a more recent study here. And as you see, according to their index, democracy peaked around 2014-15 and is now down to the lowest level. And of course, COVID-19 here, as you may see here, caused a dramatic drop, increased regulations and so on. But then the drop has continued. So what's happening here is not that democracy, voting, elections and so on disappear. What's happening is that the kind of institutions that are essential not only for democracies, but for markets, for civil society, like the rule of law, checks and balances, security of property rights, they are undermined. And we can see this here in what's happening to the economic freedom. This is the Fraser Index of economic freedom. It measures economic freedom in 5 different dimensions. And it was increasing, as you can see here, this index, all the way up until 2019. So COVID-19 caused a big drop here, but it seems like, well, the drop is still there, the figures doesn't go up again here. So autocrats have taken the chance here to well, move forward basically here. And one force behind this, there are, of course, other autocracies like China, Russia, well, and so on. But populism, I think, is one of the causes. And how can we understand this? So there's a huge literature today about populism, and I've surveyed this literature and tried to summarize this and understand how we can understand populism. Some people say it's like, chameleont. You cannot really define it. It adapts to local conditions. It adapts to different ideologies, and that's true. But you can identify, I argue, three defining characteristics of populism. And one is perhaps the most common one to understand: unserious, ill-founded policies. Basically, having very simplified, fallacious solutions to very complex, long-run problems. I will give some examples. It could be, like Donald Trump proposing protectionism or raise tariffs to save jobs in the coal industries, or things like that. It could be at the same time increasing subsidies, very popular among politicians, without funding the expanding spendings that occur. Well, it could be tough on crime, putting people in prison without taking care of the social causes of crime, and so on and so forth. So there's been some good research done about this, and as you know, populists perhaps started with Perón, from Perón in Argentina after the Second World War. Perón had been in Italy and been inspired by Mussolini, but adapted Mussolini's types of policies to a more democratic system in Argentina, and started to implement this kind of short-run solutions to complex problems. And there have been some studies here, trying to understand what are the long-run causes of this. And one study by Edwards, well-done study, studied Latin America, both left-wing and right-wing types of populism experiments in these countries. And it turns out that the vast majority of these episodes of populism ended up badly. Incomes of the poor and the middle class tend to be lower when the experiment failed. Even those people that had supported these kinds of regimes, well, came off worse than before. A larger study, a more recent study, covering populist regimes all over the world between year 1900 and 2020, found very similar results. So in comparison to non-populist counterfactual, similar kinds of countries that experience populism experienced, economic disintegration, macroeconomic instability, and erosion of the institutions that uphold liberal democracy. So big failures. The second kind of defining characteristics, which is typical for populist regime, is a rhetorical style and discourse frame. And this is something that sociologists, political scientists, and so on have been analyzing and describing. And I think this is extremely important. So they deliberately create polarization in their society. They portray themselves to be representative of the true people who are against the establishment. It could be various kinds of elites. It could be economists. It could be media. It could be established parties. It could be the judicial system. So they use this kind of us versus them logic to trigger, tribalist mind, you may say, of humans. We against them. And they don't use rational argumentations, facts, and so on. Rather, they attack media, they attack experts, demonize people, and they use non-rational emotional arguments. So basically what they do is that they create narratives, conspiracies, if you want, that construct the people and its different enemies. And some enemies, they kind of construct enemies that are threats to the essentialist part of the people. It could be Jews, it could be Muslims, it could be immigrants, it could be capitalists, it could be neoliberals. Well, various groups that they frame as being, really dangerous to the ordinary people. So there are both left-wing and right-wing versions of this. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I think you can recognize some of these people here. Evo Morales from Ecuador and Bernie Sanders, you should probably know of. Chavez in Venezuela, Le Pen, well, then we have Åkesson again, and Le Pen and Orban. Anyway, so the left, this is basically the classical Marxist logic of saying that the working class, the workers, ordinary people are pure and innocent and good, while capitalist, globalized countries, markets, nowadays neoliberals, are the enemies, the elite, the establishment that you have to attack. And they construct these enemies, financial markets and so on. Anti-capitalization, anti-US, inequality, all this, is key themes in the way they argue. While the right wing, which is more, common in Europe, in Latin America, it's more left wing. In Europe, it's right wing populism. It's more nationalistic, native citizen, patriots, those are the good people. While similar kinds of elites or establishments are attacked, in fact. Academics, expert, left wing media in this case, international corporations, the European Union, cosmopolitan elites, and so on, threatening, these ordinary people. And, migrants, non-natives, minorities of different kinds, Muslims, Jews are enemies to the people. So nationalism, wokeism, identity politics, and so on are traditional themes here for the right-wing populism. So when this really gets dangerous is this third characteristic of populism. So a common tendency within populist movements, which should not come as a surprise. If you believe that you represent the true people, if you yourselves are honest and good, while the opponents are demons and evil and so on, why should you care about those people? I mean, if you write election results that don't really fit what you expect, they are fake elections. Constraints on your own majority by constitutional rules, by checks and balances, by minority rights, and so on. Why should you care about that? So it's a super majoritarian kind of idea that populism builds on. It goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it's the idea of the general will, or volonté générale, as it's said in French. So populists tend to attack, courts. We try to manipulate elections, limiting minority rights, and so on. Not all populists do it, but it's like a tendency. And this is why and when, populism really becomes dangerous if established parties use the same kind of strategies I described before, the first and second characteristic. So it's like an enemy within democracy itself. And it's, of course, deeply illiberal, It's intolerant. It doesn't believe in rational argumentation, doesn't believe, in the open society. It doesn't believe in being decent and how to treat people. So this is when populism really becomes dangerous. A former colleague of mine at Stanford, Larry Diamond, a couple of years ago, he described this as the autocrat's 12-step program. I'm not going to read this through, but you can glimpse through it, perhaps. So it's stepwise. It's not open codes anymore that populists use when they take over, and destroy and undermine democracy. It is a small step. And it starts with this demonization, you undermine independence of course, you attack media, you gain control of public broadcasting, and so on and so forth. And you know what had been going on with the Law and Justice Party in Poland, and I put up Erdogan in Turkey here as an example, but, well, you know what Trump has tried to do at various times in the US. This is when, populist becomes a real threat. Not all populists have to go these directions, but in fact, many do. There's a strong tendency for populists to do this. So in this book, I also try to explain why they are so popular, how they do this. Are there other factors than this rhetoric, than these kinds of unserious, unfounded policies that promote autocratization, this stepwise, slowly increasing way of undermining the open society, the liberal, classical liberal democratic institutions? So in this picture, this model, if you want, I try to summarize some of the large amount of other research that has been done about populism and why it exists in the way it does. And if you look at the left here, usually one thinks that there are policy failures. The existing institutions and policies in time period one cause economic or social problems. It could also be a changing, world with China entering into world markets, new technologies, robotization, AI, whatever, that undermines, existing jobs and labor markets and so on. So this is huge, amount of research, showing that, yes, there is a kind of connection between, how much the China shock, they say in the US, affect jobs in certain regions and the popularity of these kinds of parties. Inequality, migration, various policy failures in other areas. I think we're all familiar with this. That provides a ground for populist parties. And what they do usually, it not only affects the interest, as economists usually focus on, but it also how it affects the identity, how people view themselves, how they define themselves, how secure they find themselves. So not only interest, but it affects the identity of the people. And you probably heard about Jonathan Haidt argue that in fact humans do have this kind of tribal mind that I mentioned, and if you can trigger that tribal mind, the we against them logic, the others are dangerous and different while we are good, that's something that populists really try to work on. Also, social media, of course, is a thing that really has mattered a lot here. The way, algorithms, other mechanisms within the system were changed 10, 15 years ago, where you like things and so on. That has triggered, echo chambers and self-enforcing, ways of understanding. In a sense, it could be similar, kind of conspiracies or parasites of mind, some people, scholars say, that are evolving within this system, interacting with human nature, interacting with, changing world conditions. But my main conclusion is that what really has made this important is this populist ideas and beliefs, and I will expand this a little bit in a while. The ideas about polarization, identity, we against them, and so on, that triggers these kind of things. So charismatic leaders, policy entrepreneurs, they use these kind of ideas and try to make people understand social economic changes in such a way that is a threat. I mean, it's nothing new that jobs disappear, that new technologies affect, our economies, our labor markets. It's not a new thing that immigration occurs. They have been worse in 2015 and so on, but still, they frame things with this rhetorical style and discourse framing to make, people believe that the threats come from somewhere else, that we can't handle things. So this is a process that, enforces this stepwise autocratization of institutions and policies in period time 2, which in next period will make this process roll on. So where does these ideas come from? I think it's very important to understand that this is not something new. I mean, these kinds of ideas have been developed over time, and they come from both the left and the right. And in my reading, it starts, in German idealistic philosophy. I take Nietzsche as the main example, who really argue that we can construct, there's no real reality out there. We can construct the way the world works. There is no real truth, rationality. I mean, the empirical Anglo-Saxon way of thinking from the Scottish philosophers and onwards, that's not the real thing. It's reality can be constructed. Not only God was dead, as he argued, but also, the truth was dead in a sense. And these kinds of ideas were picked up by, radical conservatives in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. One example of those is the existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger, was also a Nazi, and I will have a quotation for him. So he was a major idea maker behind this we against them logic, but in particular, the very prestigious lawyer, law scholar Carl Schmitt was the one who developed this. So I will take two quotations by these guys. So Heidegger, he was also, as you may know, the founder of the inspiration for the Frankfurter School, this radical leftist school in Germany. So he described what politics, what society works like. It's like an enemy in each and every person who poses an essential threat to the people and its individual member. The challenge is to bring this to the open, to harbor no illusion about the enemy, to keep oneself ready to attack with the goal of total annihilation. And this inspired also same kind of ideas Carl Schmitt, who in his book about politics wrote that the specific political distinction, what politics is all about, which political actions and motives can be reduced to, is that between friend and enemy, we against them. The political enemy need not be morally evil or aesthetically ugly. You can define him the way you want, but he's nevertheless the other, the stranger. So these kinds of ideas were developed, within critical theory, which dominates this wokeism in American leftist wokeism in American university, but also within postmodernism. And two of the leader thinkings today are left. So it's Ernesto Laclau, political philosopher from Argentina, and Chantal Mouffe, a political philosopher from Belgium. They're also married to each other. And they argue that these kinds of populist strategies which they develop, and they explicitly refer back to Carl Schmitt, is what the left should use. And Steve Bannon and other people on the right in the US and in Europe, they also read these people and are inspired by those people. So what populism really is, it's a kind of identity politics. So they offer kind of belonging to the nation, the class, history, religion, or something like this. They provide a meaning, a worthy cause to defend the people against this allegedly corrupt elites and threatening others. And it's a kind of politics of resentment and recognition. People who feel they are not recognized, not respected in a good way. They don't feel that the welfare services, jobs are disappearing, things are not working the way they did or should work. In comes these populist charismatic leaders, and they offer this identity, collectivistic identity. And this is, of course, a very forceful thing to offer. The populist leader, they like these mass meetings, rallies and stuff like that, direct communication with the people. So the question is then, how can liberals, classical liberals, Democrats fight back against this populist threat that is taking over the world, so to speak, right now? So I devote parts of this book to try to understand what liberalism is and what ideas we can pick up from liberalism. And I take classical liberalism as my starting point and identify three, I think, quite well-known dimensions of classical liberalism, at least the first two dimensions. Liberal institutions, well, that's, principles, limited government, constitutional democracy, rule of law, of course, property rights, civil liberties, but also a liberal economy and society, the spontaneous orders, if you want, from Hayek and others, the market economy, but also, what follows from the freedom you have within these liberal institutions, clubs, families, corporations, all kinds of voluntary organizations that exist within a liberal society. And I should add here that this is also a pluralistic society. It's a society where different kinds of lifestyles can exist at the same time, because the government doesn't interfere with the good, if you want. The good is something that the individual, the family, different voluntary societies and so on define themselves. But the third dimension, I think, has been underdeveloped or not emphasized enough, something I call the liberal spirit. And it goes back to Wilhelm von Humboldt up to the right here on the slide, and John Stuart Mill. So I think all liberals have this kind of optimistic view of society and life, the possibility to self-authorship your life, entrepreneurship, tolerance, diversity, free speech, rational discourse, and so on. Moderation as well, You should respect people. You shouldn't, treat them badly. You should be humble and so on. So if you combine this, I think classical liberals have a good chance to fight back. I mean, we cannot demonize, we cannot create polarization, we cannot attack media or, courts and so on, the rule of law. We want to preserve these institutions, but we do have this other strengths. And very broadly, I can't go through this in detail, I identify 4 broad categories of strategies. And the first one, to expose the populist strategies, the deliberate polarization of society, the way they lie, cheat, attack media, courts, and so on, and their consequences, their bad economic and social consequences. I think that's a very important strategy. I mean, people don't want to live in this kind of polarized, divisive type of societies. But they don't see this because this pattern of populism has not been well understood. The second one is, of course, to defend and develop the liberal institutions. I will say some more about this. The third one is to embrace and promote this liberal spirit that I mentioned. And the fourth is to develop liberal statecraft. And I will say a few words about each of these. So to defend and develop the liberal institutions means that you really not only have to be able to say why democracy, the market economy is good, you also have to be able to, well, what I call here liberal literacy, explain why the spontaneous orders, the invisible hands, well, what Adam Smith, Hayek, and others used, called Popper and others away about the open society. It's a society with no really end, but it's something that grows up from underneath. And people don't understand this. Markets don't have a purpose. They are the purpose of everyone acting on the market. And in order to do this, we have to defend what I call a secure, a strong, limited, and decent state. I think it's a mistake, as many of the left think, that populists can be fighting fight it by expanding the state, increasing welfare, and so on. No, I think on the contrary, that we have to defend a more limited state that really preserves these things, because we see so many failures of this overextended, overexpanded state. We should support federalism, decentralization. We should stimulate social mobility. We, of course, have to strengthen integration of immigrants. I have some ideas about this. And we have to try to restore public discourse. I discussed this as well. The third type of counter policy to populism is to embrace and promote what I call the liberal spirit. So this liberal spirit is like, well, the ethos, if you want, of liberal society. It's a politics of pluralism and tolerance, where different people can do different kinds of meaningful identities, different interpretations of the good. It's up to them, and they can learn from others, from their own experience. So we have to recognize and respect the value of different personal, social, normative identities and equal dignity and respect. People should not be felt left behind or not respected because they would live in the countryside or because they want to live in a different way. It's up to them, and we have to respect that. And it's a value to have this pluralism within the liberal society. And most important, I think, it's not only about enrichment, it's not only about GDP growth and so on, but it's about, well, emancipation and human flourishing. And as I said, these ideas go back to Humboldt and to John Stuart Mill. And I have this quotation here from Mill here. Among the works of man, which human life is rightly employed in perfection and beautifying, the first important surely is man himself. That's what the liberal society is about: self-improvement, virtues, and human flourishing. And to do this, we also have to be better at creating liberal narratives. I mean, the populists have narratives of a different kind of polarized kind of narratives, conspiracies. But there are many stories out there to explain how, well, the liberal spirit, the liberal society really is something that is worth fighting for and preserving. Lastly, and I will not go through this in detail either, I have a chapter on what I call liberal statecraft. It's very important to understand that the world doesn't get better by itself. We have to get in there and try to improve our institutions, basically. So liberal statecraft is the art. It's an art. It's not science. It's an art of governing a country well, in successfully promoting liberal institutions and policies that are welfare enhancing and make society freer. That's my 2018 book I mentioned. And to do this, it's a bottom-up process. It's a polycentric, as Elinor Ostrom would say, process. You have to conquer the idea arena. You have to promote by money and other kinds of support policy entrepreneurs. You have to form advocacy coalitions with like-minded people. You have to invest power resource in this, and you have to use different kinds of reform strategies. And I have this list of all the things I mentioned already, that we have to do this. And I think liberals have a good chance of doing this. And what I did not mention, but it's on the list here, it's to implement high quality basic education. I think many of the things I mentioned before really rests on this, and it's one of the major policy failures in our societies, that educational systems do not really work well anymore anywhere. I would say there are exceptions. Ireland is better than the UK, Finland is better than Sweden, and we have lessons to learn from everywhere. So I will end with this slide. I argue that this requires a revival of classical liberalism. And if you find this interesting, you can find my book for free. You can download it for free. It's open access on the Springer link. So Google my name, Nils Karlson, and Palgrave, and you will find it on Springer. So thank you much. I will stop there, I think. Over to you, Brian.
Niels, thank you very much. So I welcome all of you to start dropping your questions in the Q&A function. and I will begin posing them to our speaker. Niels, perhaps let me just get the ball rolling by asking some questions that I have on my mind. The first would really be about the place of reason in liberal discourse and liberal outreach, right? Because, from my observation, liberals tend to be more rational. We are more, reason oriented, right? We are people who would like attend webinars like these. We are people who would read like J.S. Mill philosophy, right? We will engage with maybe, academic articles that tell us deregulation will increase GDP by 3%. But the ordinary man of the street, doesn't know about these things and probably don't care, right? So the thing is, in order to reach these people, I think there has to be a place where we cannot just emphasize on reason, but at the same time, if you abandon reason and you go to the other extreme, then anything goes. You see, and that's where some of the populists then come to the fore, right? So one of the strengths of liberalism is its rational anchor, but the thing is that because liberals are too wedded to reason sometimes, then that creates a structural disadvantage, in my opinion. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you bring this up because it's actually one of the major points in the books that I didn't emphasize enough here. So I argue that it's not enough with, rational arguments. It's not enough to, well, use academic arguments type of, refer to research or to discuss, the importance of growth and so on. What populists, as I tried to say, offers kind of a collectivistic identity. And identity is not about rational argumentation, it's about emotions, it's about, how you look at yourself. And that's the idea behind this, what I call the liberal spirit, So we have to explain why liberal society, and we have to explain this by, not only rational arguments, by showing that, as Aristotle, once said, or in the classical Greece, people argue that you could convince people by three kinds of arguments. And the first one was logos, rational argumentation. The second one was pathos, emotions. And the third one was ethos. And ethos is about character. And I argue extensively about this in the book, that virtues, the good life that you identify by yourself, the feeling of, community with families, friends, voluntary organizations, and so on. Those are essential to humans. We have to understand that. People are not, these kind of rationalistic animals that economists believe. We are more, identity seekers, if you want, So identity trumps rational argumentation for most ordinary people. That's why this third dimension of liberalism that I think we have underestimated, this liberal spirit and the use of narratives and so on to explain or to communicate why this kind of society that we cherish, pluralistic, tolerant, and so on, is superior to the more, collectivistic type of society that the populists offer. So I agree. We haven't done our job there. We have a job to do. We need to bring in other kinds of expertise in this. Other kinds of people need to get engaged in this.
Great. Okay, let me just ask the next question by Sophia, who asks, how do you think economic strategies affect populism? Example, capitalism and communism. I guess perhaps it's more of like the role of economic events and developments affecting populism. Yeah.
Well, populists, didn't say this explicitly, but they often, use some kind of crisis as the opportunity for them, to start using this rhetoric, to start introducing this kind of, well, unserious, badly founded policies, saying that I'm a strong man, I can handle these problems, therefore you should vote for me instead of these corrupt guys that's been in government for a long time. So I think it's very clear, and there are clear results showing this, that macroeconomic stability, not producing huge budget deficits or not being able to control inflation and stuff like that, is very, very important if you want to fight populism. You want to avoid, populist rising, taking over the political agenda and so on. I mean, I think the UK and your Brexit thing was very interesting example of this, how you didn't manage to have a very serious, good discussion about it. Emotions got involved. Populist activists were in there, and some, policy entrepreneurs entered because they think they could be favored by this in some way, and it ended up in a very problematic situation. But in general, when it goes back to communism or capitalism, it's very clear that a capitalist society, which is a pluralistic, open society with a rule of law, limited government, and so on, in all dimensions are more superior if you want to fight populism than a more planned communist type of society. That if you look at more authoritarian types of societies, nowadays we don't really have planned economies more than in perhaps Korea, Cuba, but China has these tendencies, Russia has these tendencies. Well, some parts of the world still have them, and they are wide open to authoritarianism and the use of these kind of policies.
All right, the next question is by James Rice, who asks, how does media uncertainty and misinformation affect support for classical liberal ideas? Are there misperceptions about classical liberalism that are damaging to its popularity and efficacy and are due to actors spreading so-called fake news? Or conversely, do some populist misinformation campaigns actually advocate for classical liberalism because of its association with conservatism?
Well, I think media logic, even before social media, with printed media, even before television, all this, have this logic that you focus on scandals, you focus on short-term oriented things, you try to dramatize things, you create narratives. So the media logic is very conducive, to this populist logic that I explained, this rhetoric or this framing that the populists use, which means that, non-populists have to get in there and try to sort things out and try to participate in public discussions, try to introduce, more rationality, more wisdom, if you want, into the system. And it's not hard, and it cannot be the only strategy. We also have to be able to use, movies, novels, social media and so on to promote classical liberal ideas. But, especially I think social media, the way it has developed over the last decade or so, is very, very problematic from a perspective. First, we thought, this was a very democratizing device, and it still is to a certain extent. So, I mean, we have the world in our hand, in our cell phones, our smartphones, all kinds of information, but it's also something that can trigger this tribal mind in a very problematic way. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I have some sections in the book about this. You can look it up.
All right, the next question is by Haniel Lim, who asked the question, do you think that classical liberalism should give more weight to social relations? There is actually much welfare from living in a harmonious and high-trust society, and many citizens appear to be willing to give up significant amounts of economic progress for such outcomes, basically sacrificing GDP for, social goals. Perhaps if such considerations were given more weight in classical liberalism, what has been called populism is instead really more of citizens signaling to politicians how much they value such social goods vis-a-vis economic growth.
Well, the question to me is, how do you provide these kind of services that we ask for? So I argue extensively in the book that the state should be decent. And that to me means that, people who are unlucky, who are handicapped or can't support themselves in various ways, we have to take care of them, we have to support them. And this is something, I mean, Hayek, for example, advocated some kind of minimum income for everyone, and Milton Friedman had this negative income tax, and I think all classical liberals have had those kinds of ideas. And if I would recommend a book to you, it would be a book called Free Market Fairness by John Tomassi. So he kind of combines the ideas of John Rawls with Hayek, actually, you know. So he basically says that if Rawls had understood how a market society works, how an open, free society works with voluntary organizations, civil society, and so on, his policies would have looked quite differently. And I agree with him, you know. So I do think we should care about social questions, but I don't think that the big state is the answer to this. What's been happening in Europe, at least in Sweden and many other European countries that I know better than the UK, is that the state has become too big. So the welfare services don't really deliver anymore. And this is something that is not surprising to me. I'm sure some of you have heard about Baumol's law, saying that, you know, certain types of services, especially welfare services, will become comparatively more and more expensive over time. If we're going to finance this by taxes, it won't work. That's what we're seeing right now. So how should we produce these kind of things? Well, some things need to be financed by taxes, as I said, you know. But apart from that, I believe more in the way they do in Switzerland, for example, or other parts of Europe, to have more mandatory insurances, to have more, you know, voluntary payments and so on of different kinds, non-profit organizations coming in, and for-profit organizations. So I actually did another book, just in Swedish, comparing healthcare systems in Sweden, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Australia, very different kinds of systems. And it turned out the Swedish system is a bit like the UK system, by the way, you know, state finance and all this. But the Swiss system, which is very polycentric, mixture of all these kind of things I mentioned, actually works the best. And people also think it's the most equal and fair system, you know. Everyone is taken care of.
So, Niels, if I may just push you a little bit on this and using Hanil's question here. So, you know, what would you say,
Please.
what would you say to someone maybe of a more conservative orientation who would say, look, you know, in this open society, there are too many migrants coming into our country. You know, yes, we acknowledge that open society and immigrants give us high GDP and economic progress, but we are willing to forego some of this GDP because, you know, we would prefer, right? A society that is a little bit more socially cohesive. There is actually more social stability and harmony between, you know, different people, which actually means reducing the level of diversity, the level of cultural diversity that we have. So we are willing to sacrifice, you know, some GDP in order to achieve more social stability and cohesion, and that means having some restrictions on migrants, right? What's wrong with that?
Nothing is wrong with that in a sense. I mean, as I said, my goal is not the highest GDP. I mean, to be classical liberal is not the same as saying that you just want growth, you know, and higher GDP and material prosperity, you know, all the time. You want a society that's open, able, tolerant, all these kinds of things. And I can understand that, and I can respect that, that if the levels of immigration are too high, if too many immigrants come at the same time, this social fabric may not, you know, hold together in a good way. You know, if you have people coming, as was the case in Sweden, many people coming without being able to read or write or anything, you know, coming from Iraq, Syria, the Middle East, with a very different kind of background, entering into Swedish society, they will have a real hard effect integrating, entering the labor market and so on, which I think is the key for integration. But it will also have, you know, strong effects on the local, well, communities within the Swedish society. And this was one of the triggers for populism in Sweden, you know. So for a long time, we thought that Sweden was immune, in a sense, to these kinds of tendencies. Denmark had them, Finland had them, Norway had them, The UK had them, France had them, Germany had them, but Sweden did not. But then this immigration crisis came and this party rose up, the Swedish Democrats, because of this. And the reason was that the established parties did not handle these economic and social challenges. And I think in particular the social challenges, how it affected social cohesion and integration of people. But now there's been a big change, I think, in policies in Sweden. So not only have immigration been tightened up in many ways, but also the welfare systems have been tightened up. So people are more expected not to live on welfare as they were before, but to go out into the labor force and work and participate and contribute to society, which is good, also from a social perspective. So I can understand those arguments, but it doesn't mean that we should go, let me push this a little bit, in a conservative direction, saying that a conservative to me is a person who really knows what's good for others, right? He's willing to use the state to enforce his own definition of the good life, Could be Christian values, it could be, well, various types of values that he or she, the majority thinks are the way you should live. Well, to me, that's very illiberal. I mean, we should live the lives we want to live. Therefore, we need this more, tolerant kind of society and these institutions that respects minority rights and doesn't interfere with. The state should be fairly neutral, not totally neutral. We have to defend the open society and the liberal spirit, but apart from that, no.
Great, thanks for making this very important clarification. Okay, perhaps we can end with the last one by Sohini, who has three interrelated questions. Let me just read them out. You basically argued populist rhetoric kind of put an end to democracy. But isn't democracy akin to populist ideology? I could be wrong and would like you to explain what I'm misunderstanding. The second one is, as an environmentalist, liberal ideology sounds quite anthropocentric. Is there a way we can have a more accountable liberal democracy while taking care of our environment at the same time? And the third question is, could you illustrate the difference between left and right-wing populism? Because it sounds quite like horseshoe theory.
I didn't answer the last part, the horse.
The horseshoe is like a horseshoe where if you are going too much to the left and right,
Okay.
you
Yeah.
actually,
I understand. Okay, I
yeah.
understand. Okay, very good question. Let me start with the first one. This is the kind of argument that I often make. I've held, I don't know, numerous lectures about this book around the world, actually. And there is, the intuitive sense is that populace, that's the people, it goes back to Rome, and democracy is about the role of the people, so that's not the problem. The problem is if you use this kind of idea, this democratic majoritarian idea, by undermining, if you want, liberal democracy in itself. So you don't respect checks and balances, you don't respect minority rights, you don't respect the rule of law, you don't respect property rights. Well, the kind of institutions that we know by history and theory and experience is necessary for stable long-run democracy. So I think in certain situations, the critique of elites, and I'm that kind of person myself. I've been criticizing elites all my life, I think, but I'm not a populist. I don't do this. I don't lie. I don't demonize people. I don't attack media. I don't attack courts. As a liberal, you don't do this kind of things. But that's what populists do. And if I want to promote policy proposals, they should be sound and well documented and well thought through, of course. So this is the thing. And, this third dimension of populism that I mentioned, when start attacking the foundations for the open society, for democracy, then it's when it really gets dangerous. And many populists tend to do that. Not all of them, but it's very tempting because you believe you're right. You represent the true people. But the true people well, that's all the people. It's not only your group or your majority. So that was the first question. The second one was about environmentalism and so on, I think. And I think that's very important. So this is something I've been trying to promote myself for many years, actually. And it's hard to fund things for this. But I'm in favor of what I call free market sustainable development. How can we construct policies, taxes, redefine property rights, well, and so on and so forth, in order to use the enormous innovative force of free markets, of entrepreneurship, or competition. How can we construct institutions, classical liberal institution, if you want, that helps to solve these kind of problems that the world is facing? Because I think it's a real threat. I think those, denials that we hear from some people that, there's not any global warming going on, and climate is not changing. It's not. I don't believe that at all. I think that it's well founded. The evidence are very clear, and if only the leftists or the conservatives get in here and try to argue about their kinds of policies, it's not going to be good. So we have to get in there. I think we do have some of the best solutions for it, and we should take this very seriously. The third one was the distinction between left and right populism, right? And there's a symbiosis between them. If you look at this recent election that I started with, in Saxia and Thüringen in Germany, I mean, you have this AfD, the right wing, really radical former Nazi guy, Björn Höcke, and then you have this really radical left-wing populist, Sarah Wagenknecht, and they work together in a sense, and they share many policies, So they both, pro-Putin. They don't want to support Ukraine. They don't like immigrants. They want more subsidies for ordinary people. They don't care about balanced budgets. Well, they are populists, basically, Those to the left, of course, favor certain policies more than those to the right. But in this case, they also share this, hatred to immigrants and stuff like that. So there are differences. That people to the left, they tend to use these classical Marxist arguments, about the working class, the capitalists, while the people on the right more try to emphasize, nationalistic, conservative, religious types of arguments about identity and so on. But it's the same logic, basically.
Great. Thank you very much, Niels. I think we have come to the end of the questions and the Q&A. Thank you very much for your presentation and your great answers. Thank you very much, everyone, also for attending this session. This is recorded, it will be uploaded, and please do download Niels' book, Reviving Classical Liberalism Against Populism. It's open access, it's free to download. We will share the link of this book in the YouTube description. Niels, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And please share the book with others as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. See you.
Bye-bye.